Welcome to From the Frontline. I am Tershia Breytenbach, and with me in the studio today is Dr. Peter Hammond. Today we are focusing on the topic, recognizing the road to genocide. Dr. Hammond, thank you very much for always putting time aside to do these very important topics for us. And I'm just going to jump in immediately with my first question. On the 24th of April, it marks the beginning of the Turkish genocide of Armenian Christians in 1915. And today, why should Christians take note of what happened so long ago and also so far away?
Well, history matters, and we are to learn from history, but these are brothers and sisters in Christ, and we should always be reflecting on what affects Christians, because when one part of the body suffers, the whole body is affected. Nobody has a stubbed toe and says, well, it's just my toe, or it's just a migraine, it's just the head, or it's just one tooth that's doesn't affect the rest of my body. Actually, it does. And when one part of the body suffers, it's a concern for the whole part of the body. But also, we need to realize that history often repeats itself, and we need to learn from history, especially we can apply many of these lessons to today. It's not like there's no longer people in the world discussing, advocating, and mobilizing for genocide. And so it's very relevant at this time, especially in April, as we remember the Holocaust in Rwanda, and we remember the genocide of the Armenians. Just a word to people who are a little confused. Armenia is a country, so an Armenian's a type of person, it's a nationality. Let's not confuse with the doctrine of Armenian. Right. And so some people think, why are you concerned about the Armenian Christians? Well, if they've been persecuted, we'd be concerned too, but these are the Armenian Christians. They're people from Armenia, one of the oldest Christian nations in the world. Right. The Armenian people turned to Christ already in the 1st century AD. And I do think that we are seeing signs that the people planning similar targeting of Christians in our time. So this is very relevant, and particularly at this time in April, there's so many important anniversaries, so we should care. It might be long ago and far away, but it's not like these things can't happen closer to home as well.
Yeah, that's very true. And thank you for reminding us of that. What led up to the genocide of the Armenians, and are there red flags that we could recognize when such mass murders are planned?
Yes, indeed. And well, the first red flag was they started to demonize the Christians, dehumanize them and demonize them, so that you saw they would be blamed for anything that went wrong in the Ottoman Empire. And there was a lot that went wrong, because the Ottoman Turkish Empire was corrupt and it was cruel, and many terrible things happened. And if there was crop failures, if there was drought, if there was famine, if there's flood, whatever happened, the Christians were to blame somehow. So there was a dehumanizing and also demonizing of the Christians. And then there was also gun registration, and then there was gun confiscation. So they first made sure they could disarm the targeted people. So the Armenian Christians found themselves, first of all, registered, and then they found themselves disarmed. And that was, of course, a great concern, because if the people in power cannot trust their citizens with weapons, then the citizens can't trust that government with power.
Oh, most definitely.
Just like criminals prefer disarmed victims, so genocidal maniacs prefer unarmed, helpless victims as well. They don't like resistance, because they might lose, and they might lose ground. So because they're often cowards, these bullies, because that's what it is, just on a massive scale, these bullies prefer to disarm the targeted victims. So when the Armenians started to be demonized and they started to be dehumanized and blamed for everything, that should have been a first red flag. And once you get disarmed, that is the ultimate red flag. There's only one reason to disarm people, and that's that they want to kill you, basically.
Right.
And you can see that's what happened in the genocides that took place in Red China. They first disarmed the people before the great cultural leap forward in the Chinese Cultural Revolution, when they massacred 68 million people. Well, first they disarmed them. The Bolsheviks also started in 1917 to disarm the people. I've seen a poster, "Comrades, hand in your guns."
Wow.
And that's the first thing. They disarmed the Ukrainian farmers before they came and genocided them and so on. So every genocide is preceded by gun control and gun confiscation. Rwanda was a gun-free zone, so was Armenia, so was China. So these terrible attacks can think of Cambodia as well, the killing fields of Cambodia. So, yes, those were some of the red flags that led up to it.
Okay, so that actually reminds a person of our own country and how we need to stand firm if any such thing happens. And it's actually happened, and we've actually started touching on our government trying to disarm the population. So just an interesting point to point out, and for us Christians to stand together against that. Why do you, Dr. Hammond, think that the Turkish government wanted to exterminate the Armenian Christians?
Well, the Turkish government was, in fact, a very corrupt and very cruel government. There was lots of massacres, and you can see from the very beginning, the Turkish Empire was very cruel, and there was a lot of assassinations and murders. I mean, just one of their sultans who were running the country back in the 16th century, Sultan Muhammad III, when he died, his son Muhammad had his 19 brothers murdered to prevent them from claiming the throne. And then he had 7 of his father's pregnant concubines sewn into sacks and thrown into the river.
Sure.
Many of his nephews were incarcerated in the cage. And then Sultan Ibrahim threw his Grand Vizier into the cistern. And one morning after an orgy, Ibrahim had all 300 women of his harem put into sacks, thrown to the Bosphorus, which is the channel between the Mediterranean Sea and the Black Sea. Only one survived by being picked up by a ship bound for France. Wow. And when Ibrahim was finally assassinated, the Ottoman Empire was torn apart by more corruption, more nepotism, more inefficiency, misrule, and power struggles. And in the early 19th century, after the Ottoman Empire suffered defeats at the hands of Russia and Austria, and at the hands of the Greeks and the Serbs, who mounted successful wars of national liberation, the Sultan Muhammad II decided to massacre all the Janissaries. Now, these Janissaries were soldiers recruited forcefully from Christian families. They were what was called the blood tax. Every 5th son, that is, of amongst the Christians was recruited as a Janissary, who were trained brutally to be the, you could say, not just the elite, but also the expendables, because, I mean, they came from Christian families, so who cared, kind of attitude. Yeah. And so these Janissaries were all massacred suddenly because they thought, what if these elite soldiers decide to fight against us? So they literally wiped out their elite forces. And then when there was reforms and Western states demanding modernization, it just always came with escalating persecution of Christians. It's like, as they were forced to adopt a Western-style constitution in 1839 to placate the European powers, they decided to crack down on Christians. I think Christians were a good, what they call scapegoat for anything being wrong.
Right.
And so throughout the Middle East and Asia Minor, the Caucasus and the Balkans, entire populations were wiped out, like the island of Chios, tens of thousands of Christians massacred. And in 1823, over 8,000 Christians were slaughtered by the Turks at Misangoli. And then thousands of Assyrian Christians were massacred in the province of Mosul, that is in what today should be called Kurdistan, right up in northern Iraq. That's 1850. And it's these kind of atrocities that led to the Russians to demand the right to protect the holy places and the Christians under Orthodox supervision in the Middle East. And with the accession to power in France of Napoleon III, 1852, he sought to provoke an international crisis by demanding that the Turks place the holy place in the Middle East under the power of the Roman Catholic Church. Not that he was a real Roman Catholic, nor that he cared, because France at that time was very secular, very revolutionary, but he wanted to pick a fight with Russia. And the Russian Orthodox had traditionally been the protectors of the Eastern Orthodox Christians in the Middle East. And so Napoleon III and his new French regime cynically manipulated diplomacy to provoke a war with Russia, which became the Crimean War. And so Napoleon III's France assumed the role of Catholic crusader, which for a bunch of atheists and secular people is a bit ridiculous. But in aid of the Islamic crescent on this occasion, I don't know, you can call yourself a crusader when you're fighting for the crescent as opposed to the cross.
Right.
But that's Napoleon III. Yeah. And this led to soaking the continent in blood. 800,000 people died in the Crimean War, provoked by Francis Napoleon III over trying to remove the Russian Orthodox protection over Christians in the Middle East. And this created a whole destabilizing of the Middle East, and the British and French actions in the Crimean War extended the worthless existence of the Turkish Ottoman tyranny, who thereafter targeted the Christians even more, who had been under protection of the Tsarist Russia, but now with greater ferocity, as the Western powers of Britain and France had just removed Russia from the equation by beating them in the Crimean War. So systematically, Russia had worked to free Christians from the Ottoman Turkish control, liberating the Balkans and forcing the Turks to respect religious freedom of their Christian subjects. And as Russia expanded Christian civilization across the whole of North Asia as far as the Pacific Ocean, they were also pushing southward in their civilizing mission, seeking to liberate the holy places in Palestine, which were then controlled by the Muslim Turks.
All right.
But the British had this obsession that the Russians mustn't be allowed to gain an ice-free port on the Mediterranean. And so if it hadn't been for the untimely intervention of Great Britain and France, the Russians would have undoubtedly overrun the whole rotten, crumbling, corrupt edifice of the Ottoman Turkish Empire and established Orthodox Christianity in what today we call the Middle East and Turkey. And remember, there was a time that what today is called Turkey was the Byzantine Christian Empire.
Oh, yes.
For 1,000 years, a millennium.
Right.
And so Britain and France actually saved the Ottoman Turkish Empire and extended their life expectancy for decades more. And the loss of Christian lives was huge after that. So Britain dreaded the establishment of a Russian superpower stretching from the Arctic to the Indian Ocean. So to prevent Russia gaining ice-free ports for their navy in what could be Persia or today Iran or Turkey, Britain became the protector and guarantor of the Ottoman Turkish Empire, which is very scandalous. And Turkey had been the greatest threat to freedom in Europe throughout the centuries. The Turks had twice besieged Vienna, the capital of Europe in many ways, in the heart of Europe. And Vienna had been besieged in the 1520s and then in 1680s. And they had the Turks sacked Budapest in what is today Hungary. If you want to know why Hungary today is so resistant to the EU's pressure to try and get them to take hundreds of thousands of Muslim migrants, and they say, we won't take one. Well, here's the reason. Back in 1526, the Muslim Turks had sacked Budapest, taking over 200,000 Christians into Islamic slavery all the way back to Constantinople, from the very heart of Europe. And there had been massacres of many Christians after the Crimean War. Hundreds of thousands of Christians were slaughtered in Lebanon. In 1875, 14,700 Bulgarians were murdered by the Turks. And in another town, 7,000 inhabitants. 5,000 Christians were put to the sword in different parts of Turkey at this time because they now knew they could get away with this. Russia was recovering from the Crimean War, and Britain and France had basically given carte blanche. Sure. And so the Turks were generally impressed by the British government's slavish support for them. So Benjamin Disraeli was the British Prime Minister at this time, and he saw it as more important to back the Turks than to back the Christian Russians. And he wanted to stop the Russian naval ambitions. So this had a lot to do with ice-free ports. And for this reason, the British government overlooked the Christian nature of the Russians and the Islamic persecution of Christians in Turkey. They thought that naval politics was more important.
Oh, okay.
And so 160 odd years ago, Western European powers interfered in the politics of Russia invading the Crimea, and they strengthened the hand of radical Islam, and they, instead of supporting civilization and advancing freedom, the Western powers intervened in the Crimea, in the Crimean War, famous for the Charged Light Brigade, and Florence Nightingale was the one light literally in that dark time.
Right, yeah.
Well, the Crimean War actually undermined freedom. It retarded civilization, and it unintentionally led to even worse massacres of Christians and extended life to this tyrannical Turkish Ottoman Empire. And Gladstone opposed the Turkophile policies of Disraeli, and Gladstone said that Disraeli is not such a Turk as I thought. What he hates is Christian liberty and reconstruction. And Gladstone observed 150 years ago could be applied to our foreign governments of the West today.
Yeah.
It's not so much that they love Islam, but they hate Christianity. And so they support Islam sometimes simply because it's not Christianity, it's opposed to Christianity. And Sir Tiverek, in his book, The Sword of the Prophet, observed that the great Western powers, the heirs of those who had looted Constantinople in the Crusades and refused to help when the Turks were breaching the walls of Constantinople with cannon built by Christians, they faced the last emperor, they forced the last emperor to actually reject his Orthodox faith and to actually, by the Council of Florence, embrace Catholicism. But even once he had done that, the Western powers still ignored and didn't help the Byzantine Empire as it finally fell to the cannon of the Turks. And Constantinople, once the greatest city in the world, was looted and destroyed, and Christians were massacred by the tens of thousands.
Sure.
Just in St. Sophie, the largest church in the world at that time, in Constantinople, there were 12,000 people, men, women, children, old people, young babies in arms, put to the sword. And you might recall that when Barack Hussein Obama was president of America, he visited St. Sophie and walked around the site of one of the worst massacres in the history of the world without a reference to it, but praised the advanced Islamic architecture. Now, St. Sophie was built by the Christians in the 4th century.
Goodness me.
And everyone should know this. It's hard to believe the American president could be that ignorant or so ill-informed.
And not know about it.
And none of the journalists took him up on the fact that he is walking on the site of one of the worst massacres in Christian history, in one of the oldest Christian churches, which was seized and turned into a mosque. And they didn't hold him to account. I mean, imagine if Donald Trump had made such a stumble or gaffe, historical error. The media would be crucifying him, so to speak. Yet Barack Hussein Obama could get away with such a terrible, not just faux pas, but unforgivable crime. So to just ignore a terrible atrocity against Christians. Now the Turks massacred another 200,000 Armenian Christians in Bazid in 1877. So this is the road to the 1915 massacres. In 1879, Al-Shagard massacres Sassoon in 1894. In 1896, there were massacres of Christians in Constantinople. So you could see this coming.
Yeah.
And in 1909 at Adana, and then in Armenia from 1895 to 1896. And so finally, after all these warnings, these were trial runs.
Yeah.
By 1915, the Turks had ensured that they disarmed the Armenians, they had demonized them, they had dehumanized them in the eyes of the population, and then they massacred over 1.5 million Armenian Christians, the most extensive extermination of Christians ever launched worldwide up to that point. And there's books like Passage to Ararat, because remember, the mountains of Ararat are in Armenia, which is part of northeastern Turkey. And on the mountain of Ararat is where the Ark of Noah settled.
Right.
And the people of Armenia always were very proud of the fact that they were at the foothills of the mountain where the Ark of the Covenant ended up.
Yes.
So in the Passage to Ararat, the author describes how on the road to Adana, Turkish women were given daggers to stab dying Armenians to gain the credit in the eyes of Allah of having killed a Christian. In 1881, the Turks massacred the Christians in Alexandria. That was in Turkish-controlled Egypt at that time. So in 1915, 100,000 Maronite Christians in Lebanon and Syria were also murdered. And so it's appropriate to note that the British Prime Minister Gladstone described the Muslim Turks as they were on the whole, from the Black Day when they first entered Europe, the one great anti-human specimen of humanity. Wherever they went, a broad line of blood marked the track behind them, and as far as their dominion reached, civilization disappeared from view. They represented everywhere government by force, as opposed to government by law. And so, even as the Ottoman Turkish Empire crumbled and was replaced by the new Republic of Turkey under Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, there was still a strong anti-Christian prejudice. So there was a prejudice in Turkey for the Christians, and the Christians were perceived as the problem, even though they had taken over a civilization that was totally Christian. In fact, you can see in Turkey the demography is destiny. Because at one time, the Christians, Armenian Christians, Assyrian Christians, Catholic Christians even, and Maronites, Greek Orthodox, were the majority in what was then the Byzantine Empire. But the Turks finally became the majority, and today the Turks are the largest group of unreached people in the world. And the Christians got exterminated, basically. And this Armenian genocide that you remember back of 1915 was the time when the demographics turned dramatically to where the Christians were now a minority, not just a persecuted minority, but being an exterminated minority, that there's very few survivors today.
Right.
And the Turks now have become the largest group of unreached people on the world, and that's from unreached peoples groups. And Operation World will identify Turkey is now the most unreached area in the world, whereas there was a time when that was the brightest spot of Christianity. You know, one time Turkey was Byzantine Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire, and it had the largest church in the world, and it had the largest city in the world, Constantinople. It had St. Sophia, the greatest church in the world at that time. And yet the time came when the book of Revelation was written. All the 7 churches are in what today is in the country we today call Turkey. And all of those cities today, the candle's been removed, and effectively there's no Christian witness there. Amazing thing that the book of Revelation, all 7 churches are placed within the country that today we call Turkey.
Right.
And so don't think that Christianity can't be exterminated from an area if you neglect the biblical principle of be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, and make disciples of all nations, teaching obedience. So if we don't do the Great Commission and the Dominion Mandate, what's going to happen is other forces, anti-Christian forces, could take over. So there's no end of lessons you can learn from history, and particularly learning from what we can learn from Turkey itself. Yeah. It's in the Bible, it's in history, it's prominent, and yet Christians assisted in the extermination of Christians in Turkey, especially in Armenian genocide.
Yes, that is just something that I want to emphasize. 2 things. The 24th of April, where we commemorate the genocide, the Turkish genocide of Armenian Christians, and also the fact that, yes, we need to be quite vigilant with regards to what can happen even in our country when we don't fulfill or help fulfill the Great Commission. And Dr. Hammond, so my next question to you is, with regards to the massacre of the Armenian Christians, it was followed by the targeting of Assyrian Christians as well as Greek Christians. Please can you tell us how many were victimized in this bloodthirsty campaign?
Yes, so because they got away with a massacre of 1.5 million Armenian Christians, they then wiped out another 950,000 Assyrian Christians and about 100,000 Maronite Christians, and then they went for over 1 million Greek Christians, Greek Orthodox Christians. Ultimately, we're talking about 3.5 million Christians killed between 1915 and 1922. Because there wasn't sufficient response in 1915, they carried on, going from one group of Christians to another, and they managed to wipe out most of the Christians that were in Turkey at that time. And so 3.5 million Christians, this isn't just the time that Armenian Christians remember it, they're just the best at advertising it, but the Greek Christians and Assyrian Christians are also commemorating their enormous losses that were targeted in this very bloodthirsty campaign.
And what was the reaction of the Western world to this? Did America, Britain, or even France try to stop these genocides? Sadly not. In fact, to bring it full circle, we have to note that in 1922, the final act of this terrible activity took place. Starting in September the 9th of 1922, the Turkish mob was organized and mobilized by the Turkish army under command of Mustafa Kemal, who's now known as Ataturk, the father of the young Turks, the new Turkish Republic, and attacked the Greek Orthodox Metropolitan Chrysostomos. Now, the Metropolitan is like the Patriarch or
like the Pope of the, if you could use that word, or the Archbishop. So the Greek Orthodox Metropolitan, the highest ranking cleric in Smyrna, or even in the whole of Turkey, the mob ripped out his eyes and cut and dragged him by the beard, bleeding through the streets, beating and kicking him. And when he tried to have the strength, he raised his right hand to bless the persecutors, repeating, "Father, forgive them." And so the Turks became so infuriated, they cut off the Metropolitan's hand with a sword, and Father Chrysostomos was hacked to pieces by the angry mob. This we're talking about taking place in Smyrna. The same Smyrna you read about in the Bible, the church in Smyrna, which is where Polycarp was martyred, and Polycarp was mentored by John. So the Apostle John ended up in Smyrna, and so this is the last Christian city in Asia being exterminated by the mob mobilized by the Turkish army with their hero Mustafa Ataturk, or Mustafa Kemal. And the inhabitants were trapped between the flames on one side and the Turkish bayonets on the other. And so on the 13th of September 1922, the Turks burned the city of Smyrna, the last Christian city in Asia, to the ground. And while this was taking place, there were British, American, Italian, and French warships anchored in the harbor of Smyrna. And they were ordered to maintain strict neutrality. And some of the eyewitnesses described the scene: the pitiful throng, huddled together, sometimes screaming for help, mostly waiting in silent panic, beyond hope. They didn't budge for days. Typhoid reduced their numbers, but there was no way to dispose of the dead. Occasionally, a person would swim from the dock to one of the anchored ships and try to climb the ropes and chains, only to be driven off. On the American battleships, the musicians were ordered to play loudly to drown out the screams of the pleading swimmers. The English poured boiling water down on the unfortunates who were trying to reach their vessel and climb up their chains. The harbour was so clogged with corpses that when officers of these foreign battleships were late for their dinner appointments because bodies would get entangled with the propellers of their launches, there was clusters of women's heads bound together like coconuts by their long hair floating down the harbour, and literally the Allied sailors would be pushing away the skulls and the heads and the bodies as they were going for their dinner appointments with the Turkish army and things like this. And as I said, this is the end of Christianity in Asia. Triphonic observed, at the very time that Europe achieved its military and geopolitical advantage and the moral and religious decline that culminated in these auto-genocides of 1914 and 1939, they found in their grasp the places their Crusader ancestors had only dreamed of reclaiming: Jerusalem, Bethlehem, Antioch, Alexandria, Constantinople.
Sure.
But an effete, demoralized European Western civilization made no effort to re-Christianize these areas, and within a few decades neatly abandoned them to a radical resurgent Islam. The moral disarmament of contemporary post-Christian Europe is now nearly universal. After World War I, with the installation of nominally pro-Western governments in many Muslim countries, fashioned from the wreckage of the old Ottoman Empire, the West seemed to have convinced itself of the existence of a benign Islam. And all of the wars of the Middle East in recent years comes from the decisions made at that time and the abandonment of Christianity. There were millions more Christians in the Middle East at the time of the First World War, which got abandoned, betrayed, ignored. And to just get this picture of Western Christians pouring boiling water on Christians trying to climb up the chains to get some reach and sanctuary from the massacring mobs on the pier of Smyrna Harbour.
Yeah.
I mean, this just shows you how apostate the West has become. This is way beyond backsliding. This is apostasy. The West betrayed Christians when they'd won the First World War, so to speak, and they were able to do what they wanted with the Turkish Empire, the Ottoman Empire. They handed over areas that had been Christian for centuries and handed them over to Muslim rulers because they'd found oil there. And there was an important event that took place in 1914. In 1914, the Royal Navy, the British Navy, switched from coal to oil as their fuel. And that made oil now super important. And they discovered a lot of oil in the Middle East. Yeah. And there was a decision made in the powerhouses of Europe. We are going to court Islam and we're going to court Muslim nations in the Middle East and redraw the maps so that we get control. So, for example, you can think how Lawrence of Arabia had been asked to go and recruit the Arab people to rebel against Ottoman Turks, because the Turks were the enemy of the British. They were fighting against them. And he was authorized to promise them, we will give you your freedom. You fight for freedom, we'll free you from the Ottoman Turkish empires and you can establish your own countries, which included promises to Emir Faisal, who became King Faisal.
Yeah.
But while they promised him areas like Syria, the British had already promised the French, we'll give you Syria. Not that the French were doing anything in the Arab revolts in the Middle East for all that.
Yeah.
And while they were promising all these areas like Jordan and so on to King Faisal, they were signing the Balfour Accord, and Lord Balfour of the British Foreign Office was promising the Jews, you can make a homeland for your people in the Middle East, in what was then the province of Palestine of Turkey. And so they promised the same territories to the Arabs and to the French and to the Jews. And so at the end of the First World War, you had the Versailles Treaty, where people like Lawrence of Arabia saw that they were betraying the people that he had fought with and had promised in the name of the king. So Lawrence of Arabia was a national hero, probably the first celebrity of the 20th century. The King of England, King George V, invited Lawrence of Arabia to come to the palace to receive his knighthood. He was going to receive a knighthood. I mean, amazing. He had started as a simple lieutenant.
Yeah.
He had become a lieutenant colonel. Now he's going to become a knight of the British Empire. And he waited till last minute to refuse as a protest against how the British government had betrayed the Arabs and had gone against their solemn promises. And he felt so humiliated and embarrassed that he had been used to cheat and lie to, of course, not knowing that he was being used to cheat and lie, to his allies, that he refused all these honours, which was a great embarrassment to the king and a great affront to the British people. He then changed his name to Shaw and enlisted as a private in the Royal Air Force. So he's a lieutenant colonel in the British Army, and he could have had anything he wanted. He was so popular, such a hero, and he chose to just disappear into anonymity and joined the Royal Air Force as a mechanic, as a private. And before you knew it, he was killed in an assassination by the British MI5 in a car accident. They organised a car to hit him on his motorbike. He was driving his motorbike in 1935, bareheaded. He didn't wear helmets. In fact, it was that head injury that killed him that led to the legislation that you must get helmets. So that probably saved my life, amongst others, because as a motorbiker, I came off with a helmet many a time off my bike. And when I saw the deep cuts and grooves in my helmets, I realized that saved my life. But they didn't really know that at that stage. It was the death of such a well-known celebrity as Lawrence of Arabia, even though he is operating under the name at that stage of Shaw. Back in 1935. So he died in May the 19th, 1935. The accident was on the 13th of May, and he finally succumbed to the head injuries by 19th. And there was so many things that were suspicious about this, and that was the special branch and the military intelligence at the hospital when he came in. They put the hospital under lockdown, D-notices, no newspapers were allowed to report on the accident, and only when Lawrence died, 6 days later, only then were the press allowed to report on it. But I think they didn't know if he had died yet, and so the accident was Official Secrets Act. They whisked through the inquest in the morning and buried him in the afternoon. It was remarkable, and all the autopsies, all the reports of the accident and of his autopsy have disappeared. Now, governments don't lose documents unless they want to.
Right.
And then one of the eyewitness testimonies of a black car that came past was not entered into the inquest, and then that was from an eyewitness. And the mechanic who noticed all the black paint on the sides of the tank and the handlebars and the mirror, which must have been from a car having clipped it, and that would have caused the accident, that he was hit by a passing car and went out of control. That mechanic wasn't allowed to testify. He just had to put a letter in to the inquest, which was read out, that the motorbike wasn't a good mechanical order. And he wasn't allowed to come there to testify because he might have mentioned the evidence that it had been hit by a vehicle. And the existence of the black car, which an eyewitness had spoken of, was completely suppressed. Not only that, but then the next thing is the man who insisted there was a black motor car that passed through at about the same time as the accident, and he saw it. That man was pressured to change his testimony to say there was no black car. He didn't, and he later killed himself very conveniently.
Sure.
So much suspicion, but when governments suppress information, they're hiding something.
Yes,
It's so suspicious. Many people draw the parallel with General George Patton, America's great war hero of the Second World War, who died in a very suspicious car accident immediately afterwards, and died in hospital several days after the accident. And the accident was so obviously contrived and planned. It seems that secret services like to kill people by vehicle accidents, so there's some plausible deniability.
Right.
But because he was pro-peace and against a new war, Lawrence of Arabia had lost 2 brothers in the First World War on the Western Front. Because he was sympathetic to the Arabs, because he knew about the treachery of the British government at Versailles and how many promises were broken. And he understood what was going on in the Middle East, and he was very pro the Arab nationalist. And Lawrence was already saying back in the 1930s that all of this that has been determined, the Sykes-Picot Agreement, the Balfour Declaration, the Versailles redrawing of the map, and all of this setting up of countries that have never existed before, like Iraq and Kuwait, and this is going to lead to more wars in the second half of the 20th century. He saw where this is going. He's a historian.
Right.
He's an archaeologist. He wrote books like The 7 Pillars of Wisdom. He's a great writer and archaeologist, and he understood history. And Lawrence was considered a loose cannon, a dangerous man. There's even a film out called Dangerous Man, Lawrence After Arabia. It deals with Lawrence's, it's a 1990 film, where it deals with him in the Versailles conference, and he's already seen this is catastrophic. We are sowing the seeds of future wars in the Middle East, which has been proven correct. So when you look at all this, you recognize what is the case in the West, that we have moved from being Christendom to the Western countries now being anti-Christian, secular. I mean, even the term Europe comes from Europa, an ancient pagan goddess. Europe was always known as Christendom through the centuries, the kingdom of Christ.
Right.
But in recent years, it's moved to Europe after Europa. And you can see the EU is dedicated to making Europe pagan. And those countries that are trying to be Christian, like Slovakia and Hungary, or even Romania, are getting picked on and being harassed. And people who win elections, they're ending up in prison and things like this. All sorts of bizarre things, or assassinated. So there's some bizarre activities going on in Europe right now where you can see even grandmothers getting arrested for prayer.
Yes, that
outside
is
the Bolshevik
crazy.
so absolutely insane. And Lawrence of Arabia, Thomas Edward Lawrence, T.E. Lawrence, he saw these things coming and he warned. And so I think there's a lot that we can learn from the targeting of these Christians in Turkey at that time. But you can see how the anti-Christian forces that made that possible are moving us towards similar catastrophe in the future.
Right. Okay, thank you, Dr. Hammond. That is such important information that you've shared, and very, very interesting, which leads to my next question. Where can we learn more of the targeting of Christians, such as in Turkey?
Well, I've written a book, Slavery, Terrorism and Islam, The Historical Roots and Contemporary Threat. And this book, when it came out in 2005, got me death threat fatwas, actually.
Oh, yes.
And then I brought it out, a second edition, it was double the size, and then a third edition, it was treble the size of the original one, because if they were going to appreciate it that much, and this become one of our best-selling books. At one time on Amazon, they were selling single copies of these for $1,000, and we were selling for $10. Now, the third edition, which was 3 times size, is being sold for $15, but Amazon was selling it for over $1,000, so that's amazing. But Slavery, Terrorism, Islam, Historic Roots and Contemporary Threats, also available as an ebook and a print on demand. That's got a lot of the history through the ages, including this fascinating time we're talking about with the Turkish Empire, but explaining jihad and the role of slavery and the Western treachery in many cases too, sadly, being accessories to the fact. that's one good source and book.
Yeah.
People can also learn by visiting our website, www.frontlinemissionsa.org. And there's audio visuals on the Armenian genocide, the Turkish genocide of Armenian and Greek Christians. Those are presentations you can get on our sermon audio and on our frontlinemissionsa.org website.
Wonderful. Yes, I just want to repeat that website with amazing resources, reliable resources, www.frontlinemissionsa.org. So, Dr. Hammond, what can we do to mobilize prayer and action on behalf of persecuted believers?
Well, persecution is definitely on the increase, and we need to be concerned. And years ago, over 20 years ago, I got together with other Missions to Persecute Church, Open Doors, Voice of the Martyrs, and we decided on a course of mobilizing International Day of Prayer for the Persecuted. There'd been such success with the 7-year Jericho prayer march to bring down the Berlin Wall and the Iron Curtain, open up Eastern Europe for the gospel, that we decided we need an annual movement of prayer to mobilize prayer and action, to mobilize all the churches in the world, and we've got millions of churches, to get the churches to devote at least one Sunday in the year to focusing on a persecuted church. Of course, we'd like churches to be praying for the persecuted church every Sunday of the year, but realistically, most churches aren't going to do it. So we are trying to get them going with what we call IDOP, or International Day of Prayer for the Persecuted. The first or second Sunday in November is normally chosen. Northern Hemisphere tends to choose the first Sunday in November. We tend to choose the second Sunday in November. And, normally on 11th of November, you remember the soldier died in the wars, particularly because the First World War ended at the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, 1918.
Right.
So we thought, well, let's remember the Christians who are dying in the persecution and war against Christians around the world. And so the second Sunday of November this year will be the 9th of November. So you could start now, put it in the church calendar, mobilize your church to devote Sunday morning of prayer for the persecuted church. And you can visit our website, idop.africa. So it's www.idop, short for International Day of Prayer for the Persecuted.
Right.
So idop.africa. You can find the links also on the frontlinemissionsa.org website. We've got a Facebook page also for IDOP-Africa, and you'll get resources there that you can use to educate your congregation on what the Bible says about persecution, what we can learn about persecution history, how to serve the persecuted, how to pray for the persecuted, particularly how to pray the prayers, the imprecatory prayers for the persecuted, and how to serve the persecuted, learning from the persecuted, remembering the persecuted. Many articles, audio visuals on that available on the idop.africa website.
Yes, very important. And then, Dr. Hammond, are there any people endangered by genocide today?
Yes, there are. Christians around the world are being targeted. You might have heard of Christians in the Congo being beheaded, a whole congregation of 70 people being beheaded by some jihadist terrorists in northern Congo. These sort of things are happening, but there's a movement in South Africa to genocide the white Christians in the southernmost tip of Africa where we live. And this is, of course, very relevant to us. We know how many farmers have been targeted. There are monuments to thousands of farmers who have been murdered by radical terrorists, not just murdered, but tortured to death. There's a book out called Kill the Boer, written by Ernst Rutten. It's hard to read, names, dates, places, hacked to death, stabbed to death, bludgeoned to death, shot to death, burned alive, buried alive. And it's just hideous to read. And these are real people. We know some of these people. And I've stayed in farms where, as the sun starts to set, the tension is electric, and the whole family prepares for war. And they've got the fire extinguishers, the ammunition, things all set out there, and the outer gates are set. There's the inside dogs, there's the outside dogs. Everyone's got their firing positions, and these are just normal people on a normal day of the year that they are expecting. I may not live through this night.
Right.
And at the same time, there are irresponsible politicians like Julius Malema and his EFF Marxist Party who are standing up and filling stadiums. On one occasion, some of our listeners may have even seen the videos of 100,000 people in red T-shirts and red berets chanting, "Kill the Boer, kill the Boer, kill the farmer, shoot to kill.
Yes.
Ba, 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 ba. Shoot to kill. Kill the farmer. Bring me my machine gun. And this is somehow allowed as like it's not hate speech and not an incitement to violence. They are dehumanizing the white people of South Africa. They are demonizing. You've got radio talk show hosts saying all whites are Neanderthals, and others saying whites are not human beings. Just like what I heard in Rwanda, that the Tutsi are Indienzis, they're cockroaches, they're not real people. And they even called the people who did the murders the Interahamwe.
Yeah.
They were the ones who clear the bush. It's like the people who picking up litter or getting rid of trash and cleaning up.
Yeah.
And so you've demonized the enemy, and you have dehumanized them, and you've glamorized the work of the people who are going out there with machetes to hack to death people who've just been disarmed by the United Nations, by the way.
Goodness
And I've written about that in Holocaust in Rwanda. So that's another genocide we saw. And I can see this coming because I was actually at the Kelvin Grove, which is a very upper-class club in Cape Town, not far from here.
Yeah.
And there was an African National Congress member of parliament speaking, wanting our votes, by the way. And the man said that one day we will kill you whites like flies.
Wow.
And I said, like in Rwanda? And he said, yes, exactly like Rwanda. An incredible thing. And I said, did you notice how that turned out? And he hesitated. I said, the Tutsi David beat the Hutu Goliath. Even though with a small percentage of the population, they're now running the country. Do you really think that you're going to get away with this? I said, do you know, the Boers have got a long tradition of fighting for centuries.
Yes.
And we have got, at this stage, we had 600,000 white South Africans who were veterans in the South African Defence Force and fought in Angola. Do you really want to aggravate them? And I said, and we've got many friends all over the world who are military contractors all over the world with up-to-date combat experience, and they're going to come back if their friends, family and cousins are being targeted, and they'll bring friends.
Yes.
Do you really think you can get away with this? And this chap was stumbled from him, but that's the arrogance. There are people around there singing about killing the whites and exterminating and dehumanizing, and the government's got policies right now to disarm the security companies. We've got more private security company personnel than we have police and army. There's 600,000 people in private security companies, which is a vote of no confidence in the government. The government is not protecting its citizens, so the citizens are organizing their own private security companies. And now the government wants to take away their weapons, not just their firearms, but even non-lethal weapons like those weapons that shoot plastic or rubber bullets, even tasers.
Right.
Even batons. I mean, for goodness sakes, why would you want to disarm private security companies, professionals who are there to ensure the security of people's property and lives?
Exactly.
And the only possible reason could be that somebody's planning genocide and they want to disarm the targeted victims and make them more vulnerable. So we should be concerned. There are people talking about, singing about, and promoting genocide of whites in South Africa, advocating it, excusing it, justifying it, and even glamorizing it. And then there's others in government working to disarm the targeted victims. That should ring all the alarm bells and wave all the red flags for a warning that genocide is being planned. So the Lord said we should not be afraid, we should be courageous. God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind.
Yes.
But we're grateful for people like President Donald Trump raising the alarm and drawing attention to the fact that there are genocidal maniacs in South Africa who are advocating this and planning for it and planning terrible things, and he's concerned. Now we're grateful he's offered us an opportunity for sanctuary in America if people want to choose refugee status there. But I don't know anyone who'd want to take that. I think we'd like to be protected in our own home. Why should we flee from Africa, which generations of South Africans have built up and invested in, where our family members are buried? Why would we want to leave? So we're grateful for the offer to help, but we'd prefer the help here so we can live in a free and independent Cape of Good Hope, that we do not have to lose our land and choose between losing your land or choosing to lose your life.
Yes.
We'd
I
rather
agree.
stay, and we'd rather fight the good fight of faith, fulfill the Great Commission, even evangelize our enemies. God has given us a great call, and I'm encouraged by the fact that even today there are some Armenian Christians in the Middle East, some Assyrian and Greek Christians who living where their ancestors were murdered, but they are still being a light for Christ, and they do not want to abandon the commitment to fulfill the Great Commission where they are.
Right. That is encouraging. And just quickly, because we're kind of running out of time, my last question is, what can be done to prevent such evil massacres and violence today? What can
Speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves. Information. When Nehemiah heard about the terrible situation in Jerusalem, the gates being burned with fire, the walls had broken down, his first response was intercession. His next was gathering information. Then he started to implement a plan. He got other people involved in rebuilding the wall with a tool in one hand and a weapon in the other. I think the book of Nehemiah gives us a good game plan here. My people are destroyed from lack of knowledge.
Yes.
We need information. We need to remember the persecuted. We need to be praying. We need to pray without ceasing.
Yes.
We need to speak out. We need to use social media, websites, articles, platforms, podcasts, mediums like this. Share this presentation, this podcast with friends and family. Use your social media, email it, WhatsApp it, share it on Facebook.
Yes, definitely.
Get the word out. Help people to get the books, to get the information, get signed up on the mailing list of ministries like ours. Mobilize the International Day of Prayer for the Persecuted in your church. Get people alerted to the facts of what happened in history and what is happening now, so that we can be a light and we can be a positive influence. It's much better to light a candle than to curse the darkness.
Yes, most definitely.
Let's be part of the solution.
Wonderful. I agree with that. And that is just another reminder of how important history actually is, because we can learn from history and we must learn from history so that
and we can save lives.
Exactly. So it doesn't repeat itself. Thank you, Dr. Hammond, and thank you to our listeners for joining us. Please be sure to tune in to From the Frontline every Tuesday night on www.frontlinemissionsa.org. And I would like to close off with Hebrews 13, verse 3. Remember the persecuted as if chained with them. Thank you so much for joining us, and God bless.